Now, finally, there is a recording. So the car has shortcomings, as we mentioned. The combustion motor is a shortcoming because it is using fossil oil. It's leading to greenhouse gas emissions. Only some 20% or so of the energy in the fossil oil that is being burned is used for moving the car. The rest becomes heat. It's very inefficient. The car is comparatively heavy. Especially in Sweden, the cars are very heavy, more than 1 ton, 1,000 kilos. And of course, the air pollution I mentioned. Cars are also noisy, especially when it comes to higher speeds. It makes noise between the wheels or the tires and the road is dominating. And it takes a lot of space. And as I mentioned, the mobility infrastructure is enormous in our societies. It takes a lot of place, the car. Instead of a person moving around him or herself, there is a huge thing that is a ton and several meters in every direction. So it's much, much more requiring space than the individual. So the trafficscapes are dominating in the outdoor environment, especially in cities. There is, in fact, a movement called Reclaim the Cities, mostly, young people. And they have had several campaigns. For example, they block cities, they block roads in cities, and they set up, places where people can meet instead. They think it's much more important that we can meet and talk to each other than being locked into a car. We should also notice that very many roads on the countryside are serious impacts on biodiversity because animals cannot move over the roads, or if they do, they get killed. There are some efforts to build tunnels or bridges for animals, which is an improvement. Here you can see the difference between car to the left takes a lot of space. In the middle, all these people are sitting in a bus, of course, much less space, or they're traveling on a bike. Again, much, much less space. So the car has a big minus when it comes to mobility infrastructure. This is an example that it doesn't need to be like that. This is Eisenstadt. It's a small city, or not so small city, in eastern Austria on the border to Hungary. And you see, this is how it was. And then after a long discussion, the municipality agreed to make this a car-free center. And the people in the shop said that we will have no customers, but they were simply very wrong. You see here, a couple of years later, when there were not any cars on this street any longer, you see there are a lot of people, 30,000 pedestrians visited the city center per day, and they could meet, they could shop, and so on. They could have something to eat or a cup of coffee, etc. So it doesn't need to be like that in our cities. This is another picture. It's in Bielsko-Biała, southern Poland. And there are many, many examples. This is just one out of very many cities who actually stopped allowing cars in the city centers. Well, one alternative, of course, is then public transport. And then emissions per person kilometer is drastically reduced, both when the bus is used and the train or tram is even more so. And of course, traffic infrastructure, roads and so on, could be much smaller and much more efficient when there's fewer private cars. I should also point to car sharing. That is, you don't need to sit one person in a car. You could be together in cars. Either then you simply do it privately by taking your family or you're taking your neighbor or whatever when you're going to the same place, or you simply use a carpool. A carpool are an organized way of using a car together, car sharing. And then car sharing make car use much more efficient. The maintenance of the car is better organized and the cars are in better shape, etc. And car sharing is increasing in big cities. It's also today, it's effectively increasing car sharing. This is one example. It's a car2go. It's a car sharing program in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And you see there are 300 electric cars. They can take them, they can park them anywhere. If you are part of this car sharing program, carpool, then you can find on your mobile telephone where is the closest car. So you can go there and using an app in your mobile telephone, you can open the car and just step in, and it will measure how much you use the car, and then you pay over the phone. So it's very efficient. Rail traffic, very important. A large part of the energy consumption in cars is caused by friction between tires and the road. So rail traffic is energy-wise much better. So the what do you say now? The friction between the rail and the road is much less than between a road and the tire of a car. So a well-functioning metro system, a tram system, or local train system are important components of sustainable transport. But train traffic is also the best alternative for freight. So we should not have so much trucks. We should have trains instead to take care of that. It's much, much better. It's also actually possible to put the trucks on the train. So the long distance, the train is taking care of it, and local level, the cars or the trucks are taking care of the transport. This is new trams are established on very many places in cities in Europe. This is in Marseille in southern France, where I took this picture 2018. Very nice trams to travel with. And then air, of course. Air traffic accounts for only about 1 to 2% of total travel, but it's still large part. And the CO2 emissions was much larger, 3.8%. So it's by kilometer is the most, it has the most CO2 emissions per person kilometer of all transport modes. It's not easy to reform air traffic, but there are some efforts to produce biofuels for airplanes, but it's not so very good. So in fact, air traffic has to decrease enormously, not to zero, but much. So you could replace them by trains, fast trains or ordinary trains, or you can substitute it by using information and communication technologies like we are doing now. This is now air traffic. You see the number of passengers are increasing enormously. It's up to 2019. These figures in the European Union, 27 countries in the EU. But what we see, well, this is what we see here, that CO2 emissions from transport, from aviation, you see it's increasing very, very much. And percentage-wise, you have in billions of tons on the upper diagram, and on the lower diagram you see percentage-wise. And then it's about 2.5, 2.8%. But you see it's more than that in reality when it comes to climate change, because it's not only CO2, it's also the water that's emitted from the jet airplanes on the high altitude. So the total impact on climate change or global warming, if you wish, is about 3.5%. So it's much larger than what you think. Of course, now last year, because of the pandemic, there was much less flying. So the airplanes were standing still, and some air companies have gone bankrupt, but most air companies have been supported by the states. But we can't go back to flying as much as we did before the pandemic. That's a very clear message when it comes to sustainable development. Boats should be mentioned. It's expanding fast, both for business and pleasure. It has an environmental impact, but not that large when it comes to freight. So freight is in a good, boat traffic is a good alternative for freight, but it could be improved much, boat traffic, both efficiency-wise and the quality of the fuel. And in fact, much of it could also be using wind, also with modern ships. And also, ships are classically polluting enormously. That has to be regulated, and it has been regulated in the Baltic Sea. So there is much less impact on the Baltic Sea than on the west coast of Sweden. Yes, you know, it's an enormous part of our global trade, boat traffic. Biking, very important part of transport. Biking has no emissions. Infrastructure for biking, you know, biking paths and bike parking and so on is cheap and is small. Biking is healthy for the individuals. Bikers are outdoors rather than inside the car or bus. So it's healthy. Speed of biking is about 20 kilometers per hour. So it takes about 20 minutes to travel 6 kilometers, which is a fairly good distance in a city. Biking in cities are increasing, also in large cities like Paris, London, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and so on. In Stockholm, 150,000 commute daily to work by bike. And this figure is expected to double. And it has doubled quite much the last year because of the pandemic. It has increased quite much the last year. And there is much potential for biking, especially in cities in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't see much biking in Moscow or in Warsaw and Minsk, etc. It would be very easy to build biking roads in those cities. There is a lot of space for it. This is Paris. You see biking paths in many, many places. This is not so good. It's London. You see the bikers are in danger. In fact, quite many were killed. So this should be much improved, and it has been improved. This is various cities. You see on the top left, there are renting bikes. So bike rents are very popular in many cities. For example, in Paris, you can rent a bike very easily. In fact, the first 30 minutes are free when you rent a bike in Paris. So quite many students, they take a bike like that and they go to the next station for giving back the bike before 30 minutes. So they can bike around the whole city without paying anything at all. So on the right-hand side, you see it's Copenhagen, and notice quite many bikers have a little box for their children. And children like very much to ride in those small boxes. So it's very common in many places. Also here where I live and in Stockholm and so on, it's common with using this way to take the kids to and from schools and so on. And then the lower part, you see how biking roads could be. On the right-hand side, you see in Vienna, when you have good biking roads, not the same as car, where the cars are moving, then biking increases enormously. So these biking roads are a key thing to do to increase biking. So that is the 30 minutes. We went through all the different ways to move around, and after the second 30 minutes will be how to manage with and how to improve mobility in our societies to make it more sustainable. But during the break, please think about how far do you travel each day? Try to, sum up. How do you travel? Do you have a car? Do you have a bus? Do you walk? And so on. And can you try to estimate the environmental impact of your travel? And how could it be reduced? So this is what I ask you to talk about when you're having break the coming 20 minutes, and then we will see each other again after this little while. So this part of the lecture will be about how to make mobility more sustainable. We talk about technical ways to do it, policy, tools, mobility management, and of course, rethinking. Why mobility? And it might be that this is not a big crisis in Ukos, but in the world it is, and especially in the United States, of course, which is very dependent on car use. This is just some measures to think about. Of course, mobility, it's very important in our societies. The combustion car has to be exchanged for electric cars. We'll come back to that. We also have to drive car less car driving, especially in the United States, but also in Sweden. And the estimation is that we have to drive about half as much as we do. This means that we could go back to about 1985 level or so. Of course, different in different countries. And then in cities in particular, and more people living in cities, we should improve public transport and biking possibilities. In Stockholm, half of the households do not have a car today. It's just difficult to have a car, and you can move around very well by using the subway or the buses and so on. And look at Manhattan, for example, in New York, there are not many people having a car. It's so difficult to have a car there, and it's also very expensive. And of course, in Tokyo, in Japan, you can think of that parking the car is more expensive than the car itself. It's so important to walk to get along without the car. Yes, let's continue. I think you have seen this before. It's from a friend in Graz, University of Technology, who provided this one. And it's taking us through the stages that very many countries went through when it comes to car driving. The first stage was to repair the car and take care of the exhausts by endopipe treatment. And of course, next, eco-efficiency, cleaner production approach. And then again, we had redesign approach, a more efficient car, for example, the 3 liters car, as some people say. And then, of course, we have to rethink the meta system, the system that the car was part of the system. And that is what we have talked much about already today. But then we didn't talk too much about rethink why mobility. Do we really have to move around as much? I can give you this example. A friend of mine who was important in the Green Party, she was asked by Telia. Telia is a big company working for information communication infrastructure. And she said, why are you using so much traveling? You could have your meeting without traveling. So this was now 10 or 15 years ago. So it's not today with so much Zoom, but they thought, okay, we don't have to travel to New York ever so often to meet people. We could meet them anyhow. So they organized a meeting room where one wall was a big screen to see what was going on the other end in New York, for example, and the same thing on the other side. So there was a table coming up to the wall where you have this screen, and on the other side it was the same thing. So it looked like they were sitting around the same table, in fact. Of course, they were saving enormous number of travel hours. They were saving a lot of money, and they were saving a lot of environmental impact. So this is just one rethink. The renewable fuels cars is working on biogas, bioethanol, biodiesel, and so on. And some of that might be quite good, other is not good. For example, biogas that is produced from organic waste. It's quite good. And it's when biogas is produced from, for example, food waste and so on, it's rather sustainable. Bioethanol is only sustainable if it is coming from something that is grown on the short time, that is not wood, and it's not competing too much with food, for example, other uses of the crop. It's not considered to be a long-term solution because of the shortcomings of bioethanol. So the one that's good here is biogas and biodiesel coming from wood industry. This is now biogas bus in Uppsala, where I live. 83 buses in the towns are run on locally produced biogas. And it could be much better because the collection of waste is not good enough in the city. It should be improved much. And this is similar to many other cities in Sweden. Sweden is a little unusual in the sense that it uses organic waste for producing methane, that is biogas for traffic, or both cars and buses. This is where the biogas is produced. Electric car, of course, is a long-term solution. Electric car is much more efficient than the traditional car. In best case, it's close to 80–90% of the energy in the electricity is used for moving the wheels. So it's much more sustainable transport system. Now, of course, electric cars may be using either batteries or fuel cells. We'll talk about both. And then there is also the intermediate system, the hybrid car. The hybrid car has both a combustion motor and electric motor. So it can be charged and used electricity, for example, when running short distances in the city or so, and perhaps using fuels when running longer distances. And this is often quite efficient way to use the fuel. So I just looked for electric cars in Sweden for 2020. So in Sweden we have close to 5 million cars. 3% of them last year was chargeable. They're either hybrids or electric cars. Electric cars were 45,000, hybrids 100,000. But the increase of the number of electric cars or chargeable cars were very high, 72% per year. So in 2019, when new cars were bought, 34%, a third of the new cars were actually chargeable. Now, the weak point here is points for charging. That is where you can charge your electric cars. So it's only 2,300 or so points for charging in the country. It has to be very, very much more. That is discussed very much right now. This is last year, 2020, by month in Sweden. It's interesting to see that the amount of electric cars bought is the highest part, the light green. It's increasing over the year even. So there are many more percentage-wise electric cars bought in November than in January. It's increasing very rapidly. It's also in Germany, it's increasing very rapidly, as you mentioned. And one reason for this is that the environmental cost for a traditional car is increasing very much. And especially the big car producers are being fined by the European Commission for not setting up the standard that was decided on. These are some pictures where you see in Norway, the electric cars higher in Sweden. Norway is doing very well when it comes to electric cars. And the reason is that electric cars can use the bus part on the road for driving. So it's much more efficient and comfortable. They can charge on many places, and they can park the car without paying anything at all. So it's much better economy to have an electric car in that way. And of course, the electricity costs much less than fuel. So, so petrol or gasoline you have almost 5 times as high mileage cost as with electricity. Even more than 5 times, 7 times even, depending on how things are being charged. Batteries, of course, is a key point here. And this is improving rapidly in Europe now. There are many places, but the largest battery factory is built right now up in northern Sweden by Northvolt. It's the name of the company. And you see here the left side, how it's going to be. On the right side, it's building very rapidly. There is an investment of $3.5 billion US here. They will build batteries and they will recycle batteries that have been used for some years. And it will start produce the first batteries in the fall this year. There will be about 10,000 job opportunities. That's what they calculate on. And of course, they will use renewable electricity to run the factory. From northern Sweden, there is much hydropower and wind power. So this is an important part of the strategy. The weak part of the battery right now is that batteries are produced using electricity from fossils. So this is not good. And this is going to change. And secondly, batteries are not recycled properly. And this is going to change also. It's also possible to have a fuel cell instead of a battery. So how does it work, a fuel cell car? So you have a supply of hydrogen, or it could also be methanol, for example. It could be some other organic thing, but hydrogen is the one suggested. You use it in the fuel cell using oxygen, and the hydrogen and oxygen is being combined and produce, and it is producing water, of course, and electricity. The electricity goes to the motor, electric motor. or perhaps to a small battery. And the emissions are thus water produced from the hydrogen and the oxygen in the air. So this is very environmentally sustainable, and it's more efficient. It requires less battery. So it's a good thing. The problem here is um, the um, in the fuel cell you need to have a catalyzer, and the catalyzer requires some important metals. But that is a system that is being improved right now. So, for example, cobalt in the catalyzer is reduced. So that's what we see. And of course, you need to have a good system for charging electric cars. This is being discussed very much. You have cars being hooked up to your home, perhaps, or you have cars being hooked up to charging points in the country. Yeah, so that's the technical questions when it comes to electric cars. Now let's look at some policies that could be used to improve regulations. So regulations and taxation is on this level. And of course, the most important regulation is from the European Union that new cars are not allowed to have more and so carbon dioxide per kilometer. I'll show you the figure soon. Taxation is taxation of carbon dioxide. Is carbon dioxide taxation high enough? It is more economically good to use electric cars. So what we have here is policies that make the sustainable alternatives more attractive and the less sustainable alternatives less attractive. So this is also something that is relevant for example, supporting train traffic, supporting fast trains, which takes away passengers from the flight, from the air travel, and of course local or national train that takes away passengers from the roads or from the cars. So and also there, I should say, there is much direct investment into electric cars right now. So for example, in Sweden, if you buy an electric car in Sweden, you are given a support of 60,000 Swedish crowns. That is about 6,000 euros for buying such a car. So they become less expensive. And then another part of policy tools is urban planning. And there are various ways to organize the trafficscape in the city so it becomes more sustainable or supporting the sustainable alternatives. One very often discussed example is in Curitiba. It's a rather large city in Brazil, where instead of building a rather expensive tram or train system, they made a public transport system based on fast bus. And I will show you a picture soon. There is also possible to support biking. We already talked about that. And that's typical, for example, Amsterdam in the Netherlands or Copenhagen in Denmark, and very many other cities. Also the city where I live in Uppsala, but also say, for example, in Malmö, Sweden, but in Germany, you have very many examples also of this. There is also car-free city centers, we mentioned already. There is also possible to have a fee for entering the city centers by car. That has been used in London, in Oslo, in Stockholm, and so on. So it's less attractive to use a car in the city. And also its car parking policy is important here. If car parking is difficult and expensive, it's less attractive to have a car. Yes. This is Curitiba. You see the fast bus is coming to this bus stop where people can stay and wait for the bus, being protected from weather. It could be wind, rain, and so on, but also heat, in fact, in Brazil. So it has been much of a success, in fact, one of the best moves in Central America, Latin America. This is in Sweden, where there is a system, so cars which go into the city centers are registered automatically, and they will receive an invoice for the cost of entering the city center, I should say. And here you see the amount that's paid for entering right at this particular time of the day. It's 10 crowns. It means €1. So taxes, of course, is important here. Taxes can only be done by the state in most cases. So when the tax for buying a car, the tax for mileage, insurance cost, inspection costs, and so on, there are several charges on a car. And this is, of course, important for which car you choose, or if you choose to live without a car. And the most important is tax on fuel and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide emission tax in Sweden is now €0.1 per kilo, which means €100 per ton. And if everyone had this tax on carbon dioxide, we will get rid of carbon dioxide very much rapidly than what is the case now. It's all economists working on environmental questions say that the most important thing to do is to have a tax on carbon dioxide emissions. Yes, and carbon dioxide taxation can, of course, be differential. It could be different for biogas, bioethanol, biodiesel, and so on. And then we have, of course, green cars using renewable fuels, I mentioned, and they could be exempt from some of these taxes, as they do in Norway, for example. And then we should talk a little about road safety also. It's another important part of traffic question and sustainability. You see, this is road fatalities, people dying in road traffic in the European Union, going from 2001 to 2020. Some figures are missing, but you see it's decreasing. And this is the figures for 2018. And you see in European Union as a whole, average is 49 per million. This means that there is about 50,000 people, now it's 25,000 people dying in traffic that year in the European Union. And you see in Sweden, it's on the place number 5 here, 32 per million. And the United Kingdom, Denmark, Ireland, Netherlands are doing fairly well. And then it starts to be worse. And the really bad countries are Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Croatia, Poland, Eastern and Central Europe, can say, are not doing much for improving car safety or road safety. This is how it works in Sweden up to last year. I have more recent statistics for Sweden. You see it has improved quite much. The year you saw the statistics, 2018, was not good for us. But last year, 2019, or the year before last year, was quite good. So we are down to 200 fatalities in the traffic per year, 200 per 10 million people. It's the best, perhaps even the best in the world, in fact. We have a so-called Vision Zero in Sweden, meaning that we are trying to achieve 0 dead in traffic accidents on the roads. And of course, one might say that this will be impossible, but that's not the point. The point is that we have a goal and we work for that goal. And what is being done to come to that point? Well, vehicle speed has to be limited. You can't have free speed, you have to limit it. The road design is important, so it's not so the road design is improving when it comes to avoiding accidents. And of course, vehicle design, cars are being inspected every year, and the rules. So we'll look here. This is a road where you see 2+1. That is the two directions of the road. They are taking turns in having 2 lanes. So it's possible to overtake another car. And on the other side, then there is not possibility to pass another car. This means that collisions are almost impossible. And you see there is a small fence between the two sides. There is also automatic cameras, which means that these cameras are photographing all cars that are driving too fast automatically, and they send the picture automatically to a computer somewhere in northern Sweden, and that computer is sending an invoice to the owner of the car, because you can identify that by the number on the car, and it costs quite much. These cameras can even measure how fast you were driving between one camera to the next camera. So they're really keeping track of you. And it has been very important for road traffic. Actually, the speed is the most harming factor when it comes to road traffic. Yes, here you can see some regulations. And what's most important here to look at is regulations when it comes to speed, when it comes to car design. And then it's also important with emissions. So you should particularly look at the European Union Commission allowance when it comes to emissions. Carbon dioxide exhaust per kilometer of driving at 2021 this year is 95 kilometers per kilometer, grams per kilometer. This level corresponds to a fuel consumption of about 4 liters per 100 kilometers, or of petrol, or 3.6 when it comes to diesel. So it's almost impossible with the combustion motor. Well, it is possible, but it has to be very well-designed combustion motor and not too heavy car, which means that if this is not fulfilled, then the car manufacturer will be fined billions of euros. So what they do now is to move over to electric cars. That's what's going on right now. It becomes too expensive. So this year, all the main manufacturers of cars has decided to move over to electric car production. Volkswagen, BMW, Volvo, etc., all are moving over to electric cars. They will simply stop producing, conventional cars. I should finally mention something about mobility management. Mobility management is simply a way to organize sustainable transport systems. And they can be done in various ways. Mobility management centers is available in some cities in Europe. They look at soft measures, which means such as information, coordination, education, etc. They provide all these services to the inhabitants of the city or the visitors of the city. So they can get, maps, or they can get, whatever information is needed. There is also hard projects, which has to do with how to organize bridges, roads, bike roads, tram lines, and so on. It's also mobility management. And then they are looking at mobility behavior in the city, how people move around. And of course, it has to do a lot with public transport and biking. So what they really want to do is to reduce car use. And there are very, very many such projects. I should mention, for example, one mobility management center agreed with a big hospital in the city to organize so that all people working at the hospital had free access to public transport. They did not have to pay at all. And so they could have much less car use. And also another way was how to park the car. So that was organized so it decreased car use. Yeah. They can have a mobility plan, these mobility management centers, what to do, specific sites, such as hospitals, which I mentioned, or industrial plants and so on. How to drive to and from an industry might be important for car driving in the city. And especially they have a big job when it comes to big events like concerts or sports events and so on. These mobility centers used to have an important role. This is just one example, the Mobility Management Center in Helsingborg. It's in the city of Helsingborg in Sweden, southern Sweden. How to create safe ways to schools. So they increased the number of children who was walking or biking to school. And then they introduced the so-called walking school bus. This means a way for the parents to take turns and walk with the kids to the school, instead of having each parent doing it independently. And they also improve the physical changes in the traffic environment to improve the safety of the school. And also they had integrated traffic in the ordinary school subject. That is, the teachers in the school had to teach the kids how to behave in the traffic. And some also had, biking schools, how to bike when the kids were small, like 6 or 7 years or even less. They had to learn how to bike in a good way. This is just the one such school bus, walking school bus. They walk together. There is someone who's looking over, which is now dressed as a bear. And of course, there is also some police that's helping them a little. Okay, that was so much for this lecture. Mobility and transport. You may remember that there is a reading task for all of you. And especially there is such a chapter in the book that I put together with Rustam and your university, Building Sustainable Societies, chapter 10. This is a good text for you to read, and there is some other links there. So thank you very much. That's much for today.